So when you're ready for certification, there's two steps to the initial certification. So you'll see when you contact a certification body, you're going to set up a stage 1 audit. And essentially that's a readiness review of where you are at with the 4 elements to just, figure out what kind of gaps you have, maybe how ready you are. A lot of really good feedback. It can be done remotely. And then what you also do is from that point, you schedule what's called your stage 2 audit. And this is actually the on-site audit that's at your facility being audited, looks at all sites that are included in that certification, looks at every one of the modules that's being included in that, both the classroom and the practical observation. And there's some requirements for the certification body to do that. And that certification, once completed, will actually last for 2 years. But then in between that, there's other reviews. So you have your surveillance audit that's completed at the 1-year interval. That can be done remotely as well, but it's really looking at like, how are you maintaining your management systems, your instructor development? Are you essentially doing what you said? It's kind of a midstream check. But then every 2 years from that initial audit, you have a full re-audit, and it's essentially the same requirements as the stage 2 audit. I get a lot of questions from people about like, hey, what's this going to cost? How much is it going to cost me to set up GWO training? And I always answer, it depends. And it really depends upon what's on the left side of this screen. So your setup and maintenance. It really varies the cost based off of what you already have and what you have to build. Do you have to build a facility, design structures, or do you already have something in place that maybe you just need to modify or is already fit for purpose based off of the modules you're going to certify? What kind of equipment do you have? Do you have management systems in place? Do you have quality processes in your organization, or do they need to be built from scratch? Some companies come to GWO certification with basically training that already meets the requirements. They might just need to do a gap analysis and fill in the gaps, or do you need to develop it from the ground up? What kind of instructor development process? And then I'm going to talk a little bit later, but, are you hiring a consultant, or maybe you engaging in a partnership with an existing training provider to achieve this? There's a lot of different variable elements of that initial setup and maintenance. Now, the periodic audit, that's a little bit more consistent. GWO does not set the prices for the certification process, but I do encourage you to contact several certification bodies to see what their prices are, what their availability is, if they're a good fit for your organization. They'll have pretty consistent day-to-day prices. And so really the big variability there is how many sites you're certifying and how many modules you're certifying. I do recommend you contact them early because, there's not a ton of certification bodies in the United States. And so some of them are backed up, a couple months. So if you're looking to, get something, say in, March, April, May, you might want to be contacting them right now to get on their agenda. And then far to the right is GWO fees. Those are very consistent. GWO is not in this to make money. We're actually a nonprofit organization, so we can't make money off of this. Everything that we earn essentially goes into our operations. And there's 2 key fees. One is our annual licensing fee for certified training providers, and that's about $740 per year. Per certification cycle. So every 2 years. So it's a pretty low fee. Where we make most of our operating expenses is in the WINDA fees. And so every time your organization uploads a training record into the WINDA system, you pay about $10.70 for that record to be uploaded. That's essentially where GWO gets our operating expenses. As more training gets done, we get more operating expenses. We can hire more coordinators. We can hire more training developers and project managers. And every once in a while, we actually go through and reassess that price. And, based off of, the capacity and what we're doing, we may even lower that fee. I think it's been lowered like, 2 or 3 times since originally launched. I did talk to some auditors, just wanted to get their input, and they gave me this list of common gaps and weak areas. And so I wanted to make sure that you're aware of these as you're prepping for your certification. First was that taxonomy is not often well understood for instructors, and they can't often explain very well how they confirm that their participants are meeting that demonstrate or explain objective. Taxonomy, this is kind of reflects the fact that, there's not a lot of adult education development for instructors. That's over on the right-hand column is, not investing in that pedagogical training for somebody to become a trainer. And so that was one of the common areas. Most auditors say that internal audits are inconsistent and not often objective and impartial, meaning that, taking another instructor or a training manager, let's say, and having them do the internal audit is not necessarily objective and impartial. It's helpful to have somebody from outside of your specific department, or maybe even potentially outside of your organization, help with that internal audit process. They highlighted practical exercises don't often simulate the wind turbine environment. Again, get creative. You can build structures, you can chase the ambulances on damaged wind turbines. There's all kinds of opportunities out there to get creative with how you're trying to simulate that environment. Another one is that doing the minimum meets the standard, but extras add value. And they said extras like getting creative with scenarios, stories, technicians that become instructors often come with really, really good stories and practical examples. That kind of stuff adds value to the training and makes it more interesting for the technician, and therefore engages the participants even more. One that I thought was really interesting was that one of the auditors mentioned that whenever they go to a training provider for their audit that is already a training provider, say they do working at heights training, maybe they do welding training or something like that, they're pretty sure that that company has the training down. They're going to focus on the management systems because that's usually the weak area. And then almost vice versa, if they go to a training provider that's a big organization with a ISO certification and all of that stuff, they're going to hyper focus on the training program. So it's just kind of seeing where, kind of anticipating those weak areas. So kind of assess where you're coming from. I mentioned before that initial instructor qualification is often difficult for new training providers. Mentioned that, techs becoming instructors. And then the last one is risk assessments. We don't often talk about risk assessments as much in the United States, I've come to find. But risk assessment is essentially that pre-evaluation of your systems, your processes, your equipment, your work instructions, and assessing like what kind of risks is the person going to encounter, what's the likelihood of those risks, and then figuring out some plan to mitigate those higher risk elements. What they highlighted, it's not a JSA, it's not a job safety analysis, it's not that pre-job hazard assessment. Those are required, those are done, but the risk assessment is something that you do in the back office with your safety department, with your management, to make sure that your location of training, your processes for executing these tasks have been the risks have been identified and mitigated ahead of time. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is how do you get help? I mean, I'm in the region to help, but there's also a lot of options for some sort of a partnership. And I kind of categorize these partnerships into two areas. One is if you're going to independently get certified, you might want to find somebody to help as a consultant. And that can be things like finding an experienced training provider that can come in and help assess your gaps and give you some direction. Some certification bodies actually offer this service, but they can't be essentially the same person within that certification body then who comes and does your audit. But some of them will help, kind of help you assess, your current programs and give you some guidance. I mentioned before, you might reach out to some other training providers on instructor development. That doesn't necessarily have to be a GWO training provider. I mean, companies like Petzl, do instructor development. Capital Safety does instructor development for working at heights. I mean, they don't necessarily have to be a GWO certified provider if you're just trying to build the skills of your instructor. But if you actually want to get that certification, you might want to look at an existing training provider. And then training material licensing or sale. I mean, there's people out there that will basically come on board with you on a contract basis and help you develop your training content, your instructor guides, your evaluations. And there's some companies that are existing training providers that might be willing to sell you what they have or license you to use it. And then what you also see is direct partnerships. And these are more like essentially your location becomes part of somebody else's certified program. So that can happen in two common ways. One is that maybe your location becomes a permanent host location or some sort of facility rental with a partner instructor. Essentially, you have another training provider come into your location, deliver the training for your personnel, and then they leave when the training's done. The other option is to set up more like a franchise, where essentially the training is done at your location with your equipment, but your instructors get certified by another training provider and deliver that other training provider's program at your facility. That's essentially, that could be a good option for a company that's maybe just stepping into this for the first time. Maybe they don't have a large volume of students. A lot of community colleges have considered this because, maybe they're looking at their traditional students, maybe 50 a year, and it might not, pan out from a business case perspective to build a whole program by themselves, but you could partner with an existing training provider to essentially certify your instructors to deliver their program, and then all of the certification, all of the uploads, all of training material management, all of that's done by the certified training provider. So there's a couple options here. If you're really interested in getting connected with companies that might be able to help you in this area, just email me. I can send you some contact names, and we can explore different options for your organization.